The Trails, or Kaseki series, is one that I'm relatively new to. In 2016, after a binge of particularly big PS4 platinums that included Doom, The Witcher 3, and Dark Souls 3, I was about to go on holiday, and I wanted a nice fun JRPG on the PlayStation Vita to take with me to play in the evenings. Looking up recommendations online, I found one that was compared quite favourably to Persona 4, which is a title I adore. I picked up this game, Trails of Cold Steel, but it didn't go well. I really struggled with it. I bounced off it pretty quickly. Although the story was interesting and I enjoyed the premise of the game, playing it felt so slow. All of the animations and movements, particularly in combat, drove me mad, and the story wasn't enough to keep me attached to it. So I dropped it. In 2019, I saw an advert for a PlayStation 4 version, and I decided maybe I'll try again, thinking on the PS4 it would probably be less sluggish due to the more powerful hardware. What I didn't realise until I bought the game was the PS4 version had a turbo mode, and that was the missing piece for me. With the sluggishness out the way, I was hooked, and when I realised Cold Steel was actually the 5th game in the Trails series, I went back to see what I was missing. Now, 5 years later, I have just finished the 11th game in this series, Trails Through Daybreak, and earned my 10th Trails Platinum. So, how far has the series come in the time I've been following it, and how time-consuming is this long JRPG Platinum? Let's find out. So let's start at the beginning. The Trails games are turn-based JRPGs that lean heavily into an anime aesthetic and storytelling tropes. Set on the continent of Zemuria, each arc of the series is set in a different nation on this large continent and follows some of the people that live there. Trails Through Daybreak is the start of the series' 4th arc, and it's set in a place known as the Republic of Calvard, a large nation that has been ever present in the series' narrative, but never really explored before. Daybreak is also set a year after the end of the previous entry, Trails into Reverie, and this immediately highlights one of my favourite things about the series. In-game, there have only been 6 years since the series began with Trails in the Sky. You play through the game with Zemuria being in a period of huge technological change and advancement in the aftermath of the huge conflicts that took up the Cold Steel arc. And it feels natural, like the world has grown along with the characters in it. And this is helped by the fact that although the core cast of characters you control is different in each arc, there are always guest characters or reappearing NPCs that you know from the previous games popping up. It's a level of world building and shared long-form narrative that I really enjoy, and it feels like exploring a real, albeit crazy, world full of magic and mecha. The new party that you follow more than holds up compared to some of the older ones. The main lead, Van Arkwright, is a really interesting choice of protagonist because of the way that he bucks certain trends the series has followed for so long. In most JRPGs, you tend to play someone young or new to the world, an amnesiac or someone just setting out on their first journey. So as you explore, you have much of the world explained to you by either a mentor character or people you meet. And this way, the player learns along with the character in a way that feels natural and expected. Van Arkwright isn't this person though. Much like the player who has probably played the 10 games previously, Van has been around in Zemuria for a long time. He knows a lot of the major players, both villainous and virtuous, and has been involved in some of the older story beats that happened before his game even begins. In this game, the main character is actually the mentor, introducing younger members of the team he builds up to the characters and places that they go. Cold Steel 3 and 4 had this too to a certain extent, with Reen being an actual teacher, but I found Van to be a much more likeable and interesting protagonist because he felt more experienced and so much more of his backstory is hidden and vague. It made a refreshing change of pace to experience the story this way. One of the new additions in the gameplay ties into this change of Van being a bit greyer and a bit more experienced, and that is the alignment system the game has. Throughout the story, and in most of the side quests, you are given options on how to deal with situations, and depending on your choices, will give you alignment points. The alignments open to you are Law, Grey, and Chaos. An early example of this choice in action is a side quest where you must find a woman's stalker, and you have the option to either turn him into the police, or blackmail him to get him to leave the woman alone. One of these gives you points for law, the other for chaos. Each of these alignments has levels to them as well, and although this alignment system doesn't affect the majority of the game, it does offer quite a huge choice in one of the later chapters on who will and who won't be your allies, and what cutscenes you see in the story. The story itself is, in my opinion, one of the series' best. Van is what's known as a Spriggan, a handyman who is half mercenary, half private investigator, who takes on work from both sides of the law in his firm Arkwright Solutions. He is hired for a job by Agnes, a student who needs help hunting down some family heirlooms that belong to her great-grandfather. This job quickly turns into them encountering the mysterious group known as Armata, who are using these heirlooms to perform acts of terror across the Calvardian nation. Each of these acts brings Van and Agnes new allies as well as new enemies, and the culmination of this story is incredibly cool, and sets up the next part of the arc that will hopefully come early next year. After Trails into Reverie story left me feeling a bit left down, it's great that Daybreak is a return to form for the series. Overall, Daybreak is actually quite a huge improvement in many ways over its predecessors, and one of the main things it changes is its combat. Trails has historically been a turn-based series, as I said earlier, with each game layering more and more mechanics and strategy to the basic turn-based combat. Daybreak goes a little bit further still than this though, by offering the option to have both turn-based and real-time combat, and the ability to switch between them. There are some pretty big caveats to this change though. The first of these is that real-time combat is incredibly basic. You have a normal attack with square, a dodge with circle, and a charge attack that needs a meter to be filled before it can be used with R2. You do pretty decent damage in real-time mode, but the real strength of it is that it fills the enemy's stun gauge quicker and recharges your S boost bars. When an enemy is stunned, you can quickly change into turn-based mode, and this gives you access to a preemptive strike to give you the upper hand. Although the reverse is true as well. If you take too much damage in real-time mode, it will force you into turn-based mode, but with the enemy getting their preemptive strike. The other major caveat to this is that the game does force you to use turn-based mode for its boss fights or other event fights. And this is fine, because turn-based mode is where the meat of the game lies though, and where some of the more interesting changes lie. The most important being that Daybreak feels so much faster in combat. This is the first Trails game that I've not had to use the turbo mode for. It's still there, which is great, but combat felt smooth and responsive, so I just never needed to turn it on. As for combat itself, there isn't a huge amount to say about the turn-based part. You have your basic attack, you have crafts, which are unique special attacks that often get boosted by positioning your characters, and you have arts, which are spells. And when you are positioned close to an ally, if you do a basic attack, they do a nice follow-up. Like most JRPGs though, the meat of the turn-based combat is in your preparation for it. The Trails games have always used a system that is pretty reminiscent of Materia from Final Fantasy VII. You get quartz, which give you stat boosts like attack up or HP up, but they also have an elemental value to them. In the older games, combining these quartzes gave you access to arts when you reach a certain threshold, like learning the healing art here when you have a water element to level 2 or something like that. It was something I always liked because in the first games you had to find a balance between boosting your stats, but also having access to the spells that you needed to hit weaknesses. Cold Steel did this differently and made it a lot more simple, with quartz being the access to the spells themselves, but with each one giving you a stat boost. This simplification made it a lot easier to create specific builds for your characters, especially in Reverie, where it meant that you could build some insanely powerful characters. Daybreak chooses to change things yet again though, and it's in a way that I'm not entirely sure that I liked. It has gone back to Sky's Quartz, where it's stat boosts rather than spells, but now they don't give you access to the spells, they give you access to skills instead. These skills will randomly activate in battle to give you a little boost. An example of this is if you have enough Earth aspected quartz in your orbment line like defense up, sometimes when your ally is attacked, you'll put a little shield up around them and reduce the damage they take. The major issue I had with these is that none of these skills felt powerful or interesting enough to actually make builds for. Except for one big exception, a skill called Arc Feather, which has a chance of activating when one of your players casts an art. It follows up with an attack that does lots of hits, and also delays the enemy target's turn. Arts themselves are assigned separately in items called drivers and plugins, and equipping these to characters lets them cast the specific art you've equipped. At the beginning of the game, it felt like I was really limited in what I could cast. It was never bad enough for me to hate the system, but it just felt like it really narrowed down what kind of builds you could make for each character, which felt like a step backwards from the Cold Steel series. Graphically though, Trails Through Daybreak is a marked improvement. It still has a lot of Falcom jank to it. It's part of the charm of playing niche, not AAA JRPGs, and in fairness, its original release was a cross-gen PS4 game, so I can't blame it too much for looking like a PS4 game. The areas you visit though and the art direction is pretty good, from the modern cityscape of Edith where you spend most of your time to the desert oasis city of Tharbad. There are a lot of cool locations to see. One of my biggest gripes is that the early game dungeons don't have a lot of variety to them. I know that they're all set in the underground part of a metropolis, but still a little bit more colour or difference wouldn't have hurt. For the most part, the game does run pretty well, which you would expect for a PS4 game running on the PS5, but there are some noticeable slowdowns in combat, especially when there are lots of effects on the screen, like when you use arts or use your S-crafts. Traditionally, the Trails games are long affairs, and their platinums follow this pattern, with most of them having pretty similar trophy lists. Daybreak is no exception to this habit, but there are some changes to the level of completionism that I did appreciate. In almost all of the older games, you have to use a skill or item to scan enemies to add them to your beastry for a trophy. But no longer. Now, just fighting them is enough to do the job, which is a huge change to the list. You also don't have to open all of the 224 treasure chests you can find, only 150 of them. It's still quite a lot, but it's such a huge improvement over the previous games, and it does mean you don't necessarily have to have a guide open the whole time while you're playing it. The remainder of the trophy list is long but fairly straightforward. Finish the story, complete every side quest perfectly, find and eat every food item, typical completionist stuff. There is an in-game achievement list that you need to complete, but most of these also cover the other trophies you'll be earning anyway. There are some in the list that are labelled as EX achievements though, and these can be ignored unless you want the in-game rewards, which some of them are quite good. There are, of course, a few that you really need to pay attention to as you play though. One of the main ones is that you do need to get Van's alignment levels to the maximum of 5. There are a limited number of options where you can get points for these levels, and there aren't enough of these to max all 3 alignments in one playthrough. At the end of my first playthrough, I had maxed Law and Grey, with Chaos still being at level 1. You do have to play the game through on Nightmare difficulty for another trophy, and this is much easier to do it on New Game Plus, so as long as you remember to focus on one alignment till it gets to level 5, and then move on to the next one, you should be fine. Another benefit of leveling these alignments is you get what's called a hollow core when you get each alignment to level 3. These hollow cores are equipable accessories in your augments that change the stat boost you get when you use the S-boost meter. The best one of these is actually the Chaos one, as it gives a huge damage boost to Van, so it might be best to go for this one first. There is a trophy for getting all of the hollow cores, but if you do all of the side quests, none of them are missable. The other thing to pay attention to is, in between major story beats, Van will have free time sections, where you can spend time with the members of your party or some of Van's older friends to raise their connection level. There is a trophy for raising everyone's to max, which again will need more than one playthrough. You can get very close to doing it in one though through buying them the gifts that you can buy in different areas, of which you will need to give 20 for a trophy anyway, and by going to the cinema with them. Not only do you need to watch every movie for a trophy, but you also need to buy the movie brochure that you're given the opportunity to pick up after each movie. If you have seen and bought all 12 brochures, there's an NPC in the Riverside area in the final chapter of the game that will give you an item in exchange for them. This item can be used to craft one character's ultimate weapon, which will give you another trophy. You also need to visit the sauna in every chapter in your free time. Try and do this and the cinema as the first thing you do when you get this free time option. There are also saunas to visit in Chapter 3 and the intermission that are separate from the ones you can normally access, and you'll need to visit both of these as well. Visiting all of them in one playthrough will get you another trophy. The only real combat trophies that you need to look out for are for achieving a 100 hit combo chain and for getting a 4x tactical bonus. These can be quite tough if you're just playing it regularly without aiming for them. For the Chain Smoker trophy, try and use arts like Cataract Wave or Aerial Dust on clustered groups of enemies. These arts will hit multiple times, and if you have quartz equipped to speed up casting of wind and water arts, as well as the arc feather skill, you can hopefully get it quite easily on a group of 4 enemies. The tactical bonus trophy, Wombo Combo, is harder to get. Different achievements in combat earn a fixed percentage bonus that you need to combine to make it to 4.0%. The best way to do this is to try and find a group of 5 enemies, enter combat in real-time mode, hit the enemy, do a perfect dodge, switch the character, then stun an enemy and switch to turn-based. When in turn-based mode, use 3 items, don't take any damage, do a follow-up attack and use a positional craft. Then try and finish off the group with one of your S-crafts. If you manage to do all of this in one fight, you should get the 4.0 trophy. As a side note, in the in-game achievement list there is actually an entry for reaching a 5 times multiplayer. I'm pretty sure this was meant to be an EX achievement and can be ignored, but for some reason it's missing the marker. I got the platinum without ever earning that, so I wouldn't worry about it. The last set of important trophies are again all related to the alignment system and Chapter 5. Without spoiling anything, near the beginning of the chapter you will get a choice that I mentioned earlier of who to ally yourselves with. Your options depend on your alignment and which you have reached level 3 in. If none of them are level 3, the game will default to Law. There is also a 4th choice that requires your levels of Law and Chaos to add up to more than 5. Once you've made your choice, you are locked to those allies for the whole chapter, and there is a trophy for finishing the chapter with each group. This does mean that you'll end up playing through Chapter 5 at least 4 times, but what I did was skip through it on very easy mode after my second playthrough, and the chapter took me about 20 minutes. Once you've done all this, you will earn the Platinum Trophy, called the Legend of Heroes. It shouldn't be a surprise considering a lot of the other games that I like, but I really enjoyed Trails Through Daybreak. I love JRPGs, I like anime, and I love the world building that this series is known for. And while it hasn't quite taken the spot of my favourite game in the series, it's definitely on the upper end of the scale. I really enjoy Van as the main character, and the story that Daybreak builds is fantastical nonsense that I love. It feels so good to be back in Zemuria, especially after being a little let down by the last game in the series. However, like Cold Steel 1, I think Daybreak might actually be one of the best places to jump in if you haven't played the series before, as it's a pretty fresh start. There are hints and mysteries that will probably encourage you to go back and play the old ones, all the same way that Cold Steel did for me in 2019, but I still think it's a good starting point. And I can't wait to see what is next for Arkwright Solutions when Daybreak's sequel, Crimson Sin, comes out next year. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment down below with your thoughts on Trails Through Daybreak. Are you a fan of the series, or maybe has this caught your interest? Let me know, and until next time, happy hunting.